Good evening and welcome to the Calvin University Jellema Lectures of 2021. My name is Rebecca DeYoung, and I'm a faculty member here in the Philosophy Department, which was founded by no other than William Harry Jellema. This lectureship honors his work and his legacy in Calvin. Harry Jellema joined the faculty of Calvin College in 1921. He was the founder of our Philosophy Department, and his vision of Christian philosophy still animates our work today. Al Plantinga, one of Jellema's students, called Jellema the greatest teacher of philosophy he ever had. According to Jellema, Christian philosophy encompasses philosophical reflection on ideas and history and culture from a Christian standpoint. His broad vision of reformed faith-integrated philosophical practice still shapes the department's scholarship and teaching, and I'm sure you'll hear it on display also tonight. This year's Jellema lecturer, Dr. Ruth Grunhout, also stands in the same tradition, having studied at Calvin with Nick Waltersdorf, another student of Jellema's. Only a few years after earning her PhD at the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Grunhout became one of the first female tenure-track philosophy professors on the faculty at Calvin. Dr. Grunhout taught here for just over 20 years, specializing in healthcare ethics, the ethics of care, and the philosophy of gender. In 2017, she accepted her current endowed position as Distinguished Professor of Healthcare Ethics at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. We were encouraged to see her scholarly reputation so well rewarded and her impact extended to new audiences, even if we were very sad to see her go from Calvin. Her primary research and teaching area is healthcare ethics, focusing on gender, health systems and organizations, and health policy. So her most recent book is Care Ethics and Social Structures in Medicine. And if you know anything about the Reformed tradition, that tag, social structures, shows that Reformed thinking at work. So this is one of the very first discussions in print on using an ethics of care to address a wide range of social and structural issues in contemporary medicine, from technology to medical authority to economics. Her other books include Connected Lives, Human Nature and Ethics of Care, Bioethics, a reformed look at life and death choices, and Philosophy, Feminism, and Faith. On a more personal note, however, I'd like to add that Ruth was much more than my longtime colleague in Calvin's Philosophy Department. I respect and value her as an innovator, a leader, a mentor, an encourager, and a very, very dear friend. I have watched her Philosophy of Gender class draw in bright female philosophy students. I have seen her curricular developments in healthcare ethics inspire students beyond philosophy in fields like nursing and public health. She's run marathons, she's made beautiful quilts, one of which hangs in our very own Jellema room, our student lounge. One of my favorite memories is hearing her laughter ringing down the hallway from my office as she and Professor Van Dyke shared one of their many jokes, and I'm pretty sure they were having a lot more fun at work than I was. It's a very great gift tonight, therefore, to be able to welcome Dr. Grunhout back to Calvin and listen to her share her expertise with us tonight. The title of tonight's Jellema Lecture is Caring for the Sick and Caring for One's Soul, Conscientious, Objection in Medicine. After her lecture, we'll take our customary 15 or so minutes for questions and answers, and then you'll all be very welcome to join us downstairs in the chapel undercroft for a dessert reception. Please join me in giving our speaker a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. And it's absolutely wonderful to be back. Calvin has been so much in my life, and so many of the people that I've known here have been so important to me over the years. And so it's wonderful, it's an honor to be back, and it's an honor to be giving the Jellema Lecture. Jellema really was somebody who created something that matters, and it's wonderful to be a part of it. Yes, tonight I will be talking about conscientious objection in medicine. And I will try to stop shortly enough so that, I'll talk for about an hour because I'm a philosopher and we have to talk for long periods of time. But I'll try to make sure we stop. So we have time for questions. I would love some discussion and love to hear what people are thinking about some of these issues. I'm going to be focusing specifically on some recent policies, actually some laws that were passed fairly recently that shift what conscientious objection is. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. The shift was done quite explicitly for the sake of the Christian church. And so it's an issue that Christians need to think about very carefully, whether or not the shift is one that they want to endorse, and what would be the reasons for endorsing it or not endorsing it. Okay, so where do I have to point this to get it to work?
All right.
What? That's right. That's not good. Okay. Oh, like that? Okay. There we go. Okay. So what we're going to be looking at very specifically is conscientious objection and the way it's currently functioning. Because the policy that we're going to be looking at was specifically designed to allow evangelical medical caregivers to refuse care to classes of people. And the specific classes who are identified as people who hold views about sexual issues that the caregivers disagree with. So basically the talk will go in 4 parts. I'm going to start with a very brief sort of introduction to the legal position so that you can see what it is that we're talking about, what the language is, how it understands conscientious objection, how it understands medical treatment, some of those things. We'll then turn to conscientious objection. What is it? Why does it show up as such an important thing in medicine, and how does it function in that context? We will then look for one possibility. It seems to be the best explanation of why this new conscientious objection picture has been offered, what's going on in that. And I'm going to argue that, as a matter of fact, the Reformed tradition gives us a very different picture, and this is a place where the Reformed tradition needs to have a voice. There's something that's really important that's getting lost right now, and I think the Reformed alternative is precisely what's getting lost. So giving an endorsement of Reformed theology at Calvin College, of course, maybe I'm taking the easy way out. But at the same time, the Reformed tradition shaped me. It's something that I think is really, really important. And I feel sometimes as though it's a voice in the Christian tradition that needs to be louder. It needs to be out there, and people need to be hearing it. And if I keep clicking, eventually maybe it'll go. Or not. Okay, we'd like to. Yeah. Oh, now it went too far. Okay. So the law we're going to be looking at is HB 1523. It's a state law, not a national law, and various states have looked at it. It was first passed in Mississippi. Since then, it has moved to several other states. And what it specifically states is that there are 3 religious or moral convictions that specifically provide, and I'm going to focus on medical professionals, it goes farther than that, specifically provide medical professionals the right to refusal of treatment, surgeries, or counseling to patients that they consider to be immoral. The definition of immoral is patients who do not believe that marriage is or should be the union of one man and one woman, that sexual relations are properly reserved to such marriages. This is the actual wording. I'm not exaggerating or trying to put this in a different context. And that male, man, and female, woman refer to an individual's immutable biological sex as objectively determined by anatomy and genetics at the time of birth. So this is the language that HB 1523 is used. And this was passed in 2017. In 2018, it was brought to the Supreme Court by some LGBTQ people who claimed that they were harmed by this legislation. The Supreme Court refused to hear the challenge, and they refused to hear it because they said there was no clear example of harm, and if you couldn't say you had been harmed, you didn't have standing to protest this particular law. Now, when the Supreme Court hasn't heard something, that doesn't tell us where it would go if it went to the Supreme Court. They could either support it or reject it. We just don't know at this point where they would go.
When the Supreme Court, however, decided they wouldn't hear the challenge, a number of states went ahead and passed laws that pretty much are identical wording to what we're talking about here. Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas for sure. I believe the number, some states have tweaked it a little bit. It's up to about 16 or 17 states have passed a law that actually sort of follows the same thing. Now, one thing to note right off the bat is that this identifies certain patients as immoral, but its definition of immorality is very, very limited, right? Because you can think of lots of other places where caregivers and physicians might disagree with their patients. For example, you could think of a pacifist physician who would say, well, I can't care for people who are going to kill people. So people who are in the armed forces, I know they're planning on killing, I can't do that. We could imagine people who disagree about immigration law. Same sort of thing could come up. Because I come from the Calvinist tradition, we could even think about people who disagree about selling alcohol on Sundays, but probably won't go there. Yep. Now, what is significant about this change and why it's such an important new version of conscientious objection is that in the past, conscientious objection in medicine has been very specifically tied to certain actions. And the classic one is, and this is exactly right, many medical professionals say that they are on the side of life and they will never contribute to someone's death. So they'll pick different issues. The AMA, for example, bans participation in the death penalty for physicians who are licensed by them. Many physicians will not participate in abortion because they do define abortion as the ending of a human life, and they say they won't do it. Likewise, physician-assisted suicide is something that it passed in Oregon. It's passed in about 5 states since then. And that legislation was very carefully constructed with the rule that although patients could get a prescription for a patient who was actually terminal could get a prescription for something that would allow them to take suicide, no physician would be required to give that prescription. That's not something that a caregiver has to participate in. So in each of those cases, you have a specific action that is seen as wrong by the caregiver, and the law protects that caregiver. It says, yeah, you don't have to do something that you believe is deeply immoral. What we've got with this new legislation is an interesting switch because the actions we're talking about really are not seen as particularly immoral. They're fairly standard medical treatment, but they are denied to certain groups of people, which is a very different account of how you think about conscientious, or how we should think about conscientious objection. Now, why is conscientious objection so important? I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that because it's really a central issue when we come to the medical tradition. And I should back up just a little bit. One of the kind of odd things about this legislation is that it has a whole list of jobs and businesses that sell things, and it just includes medicine in that whole list. So you've got bakeries, you've got flower arrangers, you've got photographers, and you have medicine. And honestly, medicine is not the same thing as just a business that sells a product. It really is something different, and it's important to understand that. Why? Because the medical relationship is a vital one. It's a relationship that extends way, way further than when you go to the florist and buy a bunch of roses. It functions in different ways. One of the biggest issues is that patience and trust define the relationship between medical caregivers and those they care for. And that's not surprising, because if you're going to go and ask for medical care, you need to be able to trust the person and trust them in a lot of ways. One of the things you have to do is be able to trust that my caregiver actually has my best interest in mind, right? If they're looking at me as a potential organ donor, I might be scared. And this has come up in organ donation, right? I mean, we work very, very hard in the context of organ donation to make sure patients know, no, it will not be the same team that even decides whether or not you have passed on. That won't be the same team that actually makes decisions about whether your organs can be used, because we want to keep those things separate so the patient always knows the one who's taking care of them cares about them. So the patient's best interest requires a huge level of trust when you think about it. And again, this is very different from some of the other businesses in the policy. The other part of trust that comes up in the medical context is information and confidentiality. Patients are going to share a lot of things with their caregivers that they probably want to keep very, very private. Now, if they're going to get good care, they have to be able to say, this is what is really going on. In fact, when I go into my doctor, almost every single time I'm asked, now, do you use any illegal substances? And I should be able to trust that I can actually say, yeah, I've been, well, I'd prefer not to say that because I'm not doing it, but nonetheless, you can see how this is supposed to work, right? You really do need to be able to trust that your caregiver will look at you and go, okay, not real crazy about the cocaine that you're using, but given your health problems, here is how it's involved. Here's what we're going to have to think about for medication. This actually matters. So patients need to be able to trust that they can provide information and not sort of automatically have somebody sharing their secrets all around. Now, that's one direction. Patients need to trust their caregivers, but in a sense, the relationship has to also respect the medical professionals. It has to see that they have some things that have to be protected as they function. And so in particular, caregivers, and this started with as I said, with the early things that I said, caregivers need to know that a patient can never demand that they do something they think is deeply evil. And I think that's exactly right. If I'm going to care for you and give you the kind of support that you think you really need, you can't turn around and demand, for example, that I do something that I think, honestly, is deeply evil. It's also the case, and this is just pragmatic, just very basic, that caregivers also need quite a lot of authority because an awful lot of patients need care. They can't take on everybody, they can't do everything, and so they need to be able to reasonably say, I can only take care of this many patients, I need to get paid a reasonable amount for what I'm doing, and if people can't pay, that's going to get tricky. I mean, that's legitimate because they really are sort of, in a sense, providing services for those who need those sorts of services. So they need authority over how they do things. Now, that was a very traditional notion of caregivers with the insurance companies. As you guys probably know, it's gotten very, very complicated. I'm not going to go into all of the moral complications of insurance because we're going to talk about conscientious objection tonight, but there are lots of issues about how we provide health care that arise, obviously, out of this. Now, because of this relationship, this very, very trusting and close relationship that really does develop between caregivers and patients, conflicts can arise. And you can imagine this, and the law deals with this, and it should deal with it because that's appropriate. One of the basic issues is confidentiality. Yes, medical caregivers do have to keep patient information confidential. However, there's a limit to that confidentiality, and there are things that will not be kept confidential. If a patient actually represents a serious threat, either to their own life or to that of others, and patients sometimes do, then actually the caregiver is required by law to report that to the appropriate authorities to try to either preserve the life of the patient or to preserve the life of others who might be there. But you can see right off the bat, this gets very complicated because how serious a threat actually counts here? Who gets to decide that? How do we figure these things out? Whose lives count? I mean, if somebody's talking about, I don't know, killing somebody in computer games, should we be worried about it? Probably not. You can see that this gets very complicated very, very fast. And so you've got this conflict of values, and physicians regularly have to sort of say, well, I know confidentiality is important, but I just know that these other values are important. How do I sort of sort out where those should go? Likewise, I said the patient has to trust the caregiver that, as a matter of fact, the caregiver's primary concern, and notice I'm saying primary concern, right? Caregiver has lots of other concerns. They want to make a decent living. They want to make sure they're taking care of other patients. But when the caregiver is dealing with an actual patient, the caregiver really does have to care about the best interests of that patient, and that better be at the top of their chart. I mean, that really is one of the most important things they can do. Again, does this set up a conflict? You betcha. Because people have different opinions about what's really in their best interests, and they fight about that quite regularly. These conflicts can arise, obviously, when the patient wants something that the physician thinks will be really bad for the patient. And this does occur. I think when I was actually raising my little kids, was one of the times when people started getting very upset about the overuse of antibiotics. It really became an issue. And yet parents kept showing up at doctors' offices and saying, my kid's not feeling well, I want antibiotics. And the doctor would sit there and say, well, you really can't get antibiotics. They're not good for your kid because they're going to sort of lower its ability to fight off other things, and they're not going to help with this particular infection or particular problem. So you get those sorts of conflicts regularly in medicine. They just happen. Again, there's no easy solutions. I mean, there really aren't, because what people think is in their best interest can be very different depending on sort of what their values are, how they understand those sorts of things, and even what they're planning to do. And so, again, you have to weigh, in this kind of a case, the patient's autonomy, the patient's right to make their own decisions, their sense of who they are, what matters to them. You have to weigh that against the expertise of the caregiver. Again, and the caregiver really is the one that comes in with expertise. They're the ones with medical knowledge. That's why the patient is visiting them, so we shouldn't be surprised at that particularly. Now, conscientious objection usually takes effect in cases where there's the deepest conflict, honestly, between patients and physicians. So a couple of examples that regularly show up. I will just say these are not, unusual cases. We can have a patient whose health really is threatened by their pregnancy, but the physician believes that abortion is murder. What should the physician do? How are they going to deal with this, right? And you can see this is a case where the physician's own moral, I'm sorry, I cannot participate in a killing, but at the same time, the patient really does, for their own health's sake, believes they need the abortion. How are they going to think about this one? We're seeing this in recent days, actually, and if you saw this actually came up in law courts. Some of the patients who get coronavirus are convinced that ivermectin, which is a horse dewormer, will actually heal them, and they want to take it. Caregivers want to say ivermectin's not only not going to help, it actually could harm you and make you worse off in terms of your health. And if you saw recently, there was a case where a patient did this. A lawyer actually said patients should get whatever they want, or the judge said that. And then it went back to court, and the next judge said, no, you don't get ivermectin. So we're still kind of up in the air on that particular one. But also, and this is a case that a couple of them have come up here in Michigan, actually fairly serious cases, you might have a case where a care team sees a child with serious cancer and believes that child's cancer should be treated with surgery and chemo. This is the way we're going to save the child's life. The parents, however, believe the child needs herbs and prayer, and you find this with some families. So should the parents walk out of the hospital door with their child, or should the caregivers, the care team, say, no, we're going to have to go to court, we're going to get a guardian, we're going to actually try to make sure we get the chemo and the surgery to save this child's life? These are distressing questions. I will just say they're horrifying questions for the people on both sides of most of these discussions. Now, conscientious objection is a very basic principle. It's important. It goes back decades, and in certain ways it goes back centuries, that as a matter of fact, medical professionals, they really are experts. Yes, they need to give care to patients, but there are things they cannot be demanded to do. And classically, it's an action, an evil action, that is identified. I said this already, but it's worth restating. That conscientious objection applies to certain actions that the caregiver believes are deeply evil. Classic cases, abortion, suicide, we talked about both of those. For Roman Catholics, actually this comes up in both assisted reproduction and contraception, which at least conservative Catholics pretty much accept as completely unacceptable and immoral. And the contraception one has come up quite a bit with pharmaceuticals, where pharmacists have to actually distribute contraceptions that they think are evil. That one, the law courts have decided that they can just grab another pharmacist who can hand it out, so that pretty much solves the problem. But if they're in a rural area where there's not a lot of access to pharmacies and they're the only pharmacist, then it's a minor enough problem for them that they do have to hand it to the patient. And again, you can hear the weighing of the values, right? I mean, a lot depends on sort of how much harm is being done, how deep the evil is understood to be, in those sorts of things. Now, the basic structure, of course, is obviously that the professional believes the action is wrong. It's got to be deeply enough wrong that they really don't want to do it. And this is important, the professional will not do it for anyone. If you are a caregiver and you really think suicide is always wrong, you will not write a prescription for suicide, a prescription for suicide pills for any patient, no matter what. That's just going to be the end of it. It's the action that is a matter of fact. Now, HB 1523 shifts that, because they're not talking about specific actions. Instead, the law is very specific that it allows caregivers to refuse medical treatment to groups of people who hold views that they find morally unacceptable. And you can hear the shift in how that would work. The actions themselves are not actually thought to be wrong. Caregivers give those same treatments to many other patients. It's the patient that the caregiver chooses not to treat. One of the first cases that actually hit, and it actually occurred before this law, but it hit the news, and it might have actually been related to sort of the moving forward on this law, was a case of a pediatrician who wrote a letter to a young family. They were expecting a child. They were expecting this pediatrician to be their pediatrician. And she wrote them a letter saying, I'm sorry, I can't take on your child because you're a lesbian couple, and so I can't do it. Now, you can see in this kind of a case, it's not the action that's wrong, because the pediatrician would have been doing what pediatricians do, weighing the child, doing vaccinations, making sure development was proper, I mean, just checking with all those sorts of things. That the pediatrician was comfortable doing, it was the doing it for the child of a lesbian couple that was seen as unacceptable or immoral. And so that really is an important shift, as a matter of fact. And we're going to try for another important shift. Working on it. Yeah, it would work better if the button would work. There we go. Okay, oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. So there's the pediatrician. And you can see that that was very much a case where the refusal that was offered was very specifically refusal of providing care to a family because they had certain views of sexual relations that the pediatrician did not accept. I mean, it was a straightforward case in that sort of version. Now, one of the things that makes this paper, quite frankly, a little bit difficult, or this lecture to give, and also one of the things that we're sort of working through on all of this, is that the groups supporting this law have not really developed a huge moral defense. The law was put into place, it was said it was conscientious objection, they used that language, but there hasn't been a really careful moral defense. And as I said, the medicine gets listed in all these other business fields. They sort of show up in that context. Why it's only sexual morality that really matters and not some of the other, immoral sorts of positions that we might worry about, we're not clear. And it is worth, just to be fair, the law does exempt emergency treatment from coverage. You cannot deny emergency treatment to anyone for this reason. It doesn't fit into that. But it does seem that very, very strongly in this law is the notion of individual purity, that it's really important for caregivers to maintain their individual purity, and that's why this law protects them as a matter of sort of conscientious objection. And part of maintaining purity is this notion that you need to avoid the impure. If you hang out with the impure, it rubs off. It somehow sort of gets to you. Very strong focus as well on the individual self, that I need to maintain myself as pure, I need to keep myself clean, and that's why I cannot engage with these groups of people. And because each individual is seen as maintaining their own freedom from sin, they're the one that has to keep themselves clean, associating with the impure threatens that individual purity. You need distance. And the picture we get then is that freedom of conscience, what has to be protected with these new conscientious objection laws, is to protect the pure from close connections to the impure. That seems to be, to a fairly large extent, what is functioning in there. However, and here I think I can move relatively quickly, I'm going to assume that most of you are fairly familiar with Scripture. The focus on individual purity is actually problematic, and I will just say it's contrary to certain basic gospel teachings. Jesus was known to associate with the impure quite frequently. Tax collectors and prostitutes were among the more popular ones. Christians are regularly told that we need to heal the sick and feed the hungry, and that's not limited to only those who hold the right views. It's just the hungry and the sick that we're actually supposed to be caring for. Christians are also specifically told that they are to do good to their enemies, to love those who stand against them. And so distancing yourself from those with whom you disagree is going to be a little bit problematic. And the parable of the sheep and the goats, you guys are probably familiar with the parable of the sheep and the goats, but it's the parable where Jesus very specifically says, those who are really my followers are those who care for the sick, who feed the hungry, who are with the prisoners in prison, whereas the goats, unfortunately, are the people who are much more concerned with maintaining the proper sort of name for God, which is probably not what apparently Jesus thought was the most important thing in these things. But I am not preaching a sermon, so I'm going to keep moving on and argue that there is a very, very important Reformed alternative. And what really roots this Reformed alternative is that it does recognize individualism. It does respect individualism in really important ways, but it doesn't automatically make it an individual purity model, because there's a difference between how we think about individualism based on purity and maintaining distance from things that could make you impure, and individualism that actually sees people differently. The Reformed tradition, in its better days, argues that individuals all deserve respect. They deserve to be treated with dignity because each individual does bear the image of God. As a matter of fact, that is what every individual is owed. And that is a view that moves in the direction of individual rights in some very important ways. It's not so much, I got to keep my group here, it's that I have to make sure that every individual is protected at a certain level, that their dignity is recognized by how we have structured things. And the Reformed conception of sin is really important for developing this particular picture of things, because the Reformed tradition has taught that sin affects all aspects of human life, not just my individual actions, but also the policies and the rules and the things that I set up in culture, which is why, of course, I am interested in social structures. I learned this while I was at Calvin, and it's been vital for me thinking about these things. We have to look at structural issues and the way that they can be shaped by sinful practices. We have to look at that and think about how this works. And historically, if you actually do look at the history, this has been an incredibly important background for the rejection of individual rights and dignity. I mean, this really was one of the places, not the only place, but it is one of the really central places where we see that being protected. And if we go way back in the Reformed tradition, Zwingli, it goes way back, centuries, he actually was dead set against personal charity. He didn't think that the poor should be fed by individuals, dropping little money in their boxes. Instead, he argued that there should be kind of basically a tithing tax that everybody should have to pay, and that everybody's needs should be met. I mean, he was pretty clear about that fact, because he believed that the individual charity relationships set up a relationship between the individuals, between the poor and the rich, where the poor always had to see the rich as being more important, as being higher, loftier, those sorts of things. And to Zwingli's notion, that was contrary to the basic teaching of we all stand in a certain level of equal dignity. Likewise, Calvin himself in his own institutes called for the freedom not just of Protestants, don't just do religious freedom for one group, but freedom for all peaceable believers. I mean, this is Calvin's institutes we're going back to here. It's pretty far back. It would be faster if this would work. There we go. Okay. So what we need, and I'm quoting somebody who is in the audience, so we need a recognition of rights that are structured so that they protect all the persons, that we really are concerned with the basic structure of social relationships so that everyone concerned in those relationships is treated with protection, with respect. And here's a quote from Nick Walterstorff: "Rights are the normative bonds between oneself and the other." And for the most part, these normative bonds are not generated by any exercise of the will. It's not like I get to only watch your rights if I feel like it, right? They exist in advance. The bond is there already. The other comes into my presence already standing in this normative bond to me. Why? Because when I look at the other, what I'm seeing is a creature of God, right? I'm seeing someone who matters. They've got to matter to me, and that's how it's got to function. So the Reformed alternative then, rather than focusing purely on individual personal purity, tends to focus structural protection, because that's what gets you reciprocal respect. Your dignity, my dignity. Your rights, my rights. We want to make sure that they're both protected. It also recognizes that the individual's conscience is not always the source of absolute righteousness. Yes, I can feel that it would be right to do something, but all of us can also be biased. I mean, sin really does go deep, and the Reformed tradition has recognized that it goes deep. We all need certain social structures that prevent us from ignoring the bias that we might have or not seeing some of the prejudice that might exist there. So what you need is systems that, rather than protecting the powerful and subjecting the weak or the vulnerable to that power, the right should set up systems where each individual treats others the way they want to be treated themselves. Oh, was that a scriptural morality? Yes, as a matter of fact, you guys know the golden rule. We should be treating others the way we would prefer to be treated. And as a matter of fact, this sort of recognition of how important it is to protect everyone in the system is, to some extent, a reflection of the golden rule. There we go. Now, I'll move to a conclusion. We've got the Reformed tradition, we've got the individual purity picture, we've got, and then this new version of conscientious objection. Now, medicine has a long history. I mean, it literally goes back. There were debates in the 1600s about when the plague hit a place, whether physicians could leave, because the argument was, no, I'm sorry, if you became a physician and you care about the best interests of your patient, you're going to have to actually risk your own life under these sorts of circumstances. So there's a long history of thinking about the relationship between patients and caregivers in medicine. Medicine is not just an object to be sold to the highest bidder. It's not an object. It's a moral relationship between the caregiver and the patient. It also should not be a practice that's reserved just for certain groups, held back from others. Even in wartime, if you are a member of the Red Cross and you've got an enemy soldier who's over there wounded, you are required to provide them care because that is your job as a caregiver. This is a really high-powered and very demanding claim on caregivers. And it's the patient's well-being that is supposed to define the relationship. Now, obviously, there's limitations on time, limitations that can go on, conflicts, all of those can occur. But you want to go into medicine, you are going to be a caregiver who has to care about the best interests of your patient. And there we go. Even in the Christian church, interestingly enough, this was actually, I shouldn't say even in, actually this was an important part of Christian development of hospitals. And if you look around the US, for example, and you look at how many hospitals are Lutheran this and Methodist that, and there was a reason why so many churches were involved with setting up medical care, was because this was seen as one of the really important parts of the Christian church's business, the things that it had to do. And that care, generally speaking, was supposed to be provided to those who needed it. It was often provided to the poor because they were the ones who could least afford it. It was not generally limited to those who held the correct religious views. And this is something I think that the Reformed tradition has the grounds for and needs to be defending today, and needs to be defending pretty loudly. Ironically, and this really is an irony, but it's interesting to think about, I guess. We live in a very complex political world. I'm not going to go heavily into that political world because that's not the topic that I'm talking about today. But one of the real ironies is that if the Supreme Court decided that, yes, HB 1523, as a matter of fact, is a new version of conscientious objection, but it's okay and we're going to pass it, that would be actually disastrous for the white evangelical groups who supported HB 1523. Why is that? Pretty straightforward reason. Right now we're seeing anti-vax people heading into hospitals at very, very high rates. A lot of states have run out of ICU beds and are having to decide Alaska, for example, is literally having to decide who's going to get care because they do not have enough hospital resources to actually take care of people. One of the groups that has very, very high numbers of non-vaccination are white evangelicals because they believe that their faith will save them and so therefore they shouldn't need it. Now, if medical caregivers can refuse care to those who they disagree with morally, which is what HB 1523 says, then caregivers could say, morally, we disagree with the anti-vaxxers. We think they are putting too much of a burden on other people. They are harming the lives of others. They're endangering others. And I will just say, there are some caregivers who are saying this. Now, the hospital systems in general are saying, no, we are not going there. That's not what medical care is. But there are some caregivers who are starting to say, why couldn't they just get vaccinated? I can't sort of harm other people because this person couldn't get around to getting vaccinated. They think it's immoral. That is exactly what HB 1523 has just said is an acceptable reason for refusing care. And so there's this odd sort of situation where you find that the very people who wanted, or perhaps wanted, it's hard to tell, but the very groups that wanted this kind of policy are the ones who actually may be paying for it and getting hurt by it in some pretty serious ways. I'll just say, I think that would be deeply wrong. I do not think that, as a matter of fact, caregivers should be sitting there and deciding which people are going to get care based on sort of what their moral views are and some of those sorts of things. I mean, it doesn't matter which side of these debates you're on. As a matter of fact, that's not how it should go. But I do think, and here's where I'd like to really emphasize, the Reformed tradition has some really important contributions here. This needs to be said, and it needs to be said loudly, that as a matter of fact, when Christian groups promote rights, promote policies, they should be policies that I'm willing to live with regardless of which side of that particular issue I'm on. I should be able to take it when I'm the one who has the power to decide who gets medical care, but I should also be willing to take exactly that same law when I'm the one affected by that medical care, and that means that laws that don't protect the vulnerable and the weak should really never be promoted. So we'll end with the same picture that I started with. You guys are probably familiar, so many pictures of the Good Samaritan have in the background the Pharisee and the Sadducee who walked on by. We're called to be Samaritans. That's what we're called for. We're never called to be the Pharisees walking on past to protect our own purity. That's not right. And I'll stop there. Now, I'm happy to do questions if there's questions or comments or whatever people want to offer. I'd love to hear it. The rule at Calvin used to be always that students got to start first. So if there's, I don't know who all the students are and who's not students. Many of you look very young to me. But I'd be really happy to take any questions or comments or whatever you like. I will do my best. I often rephrase it, and I'm not always sure that's fair, but I'll see what I can do. Yeah.
Do you foresee a future where doctors are more inclined by their political views than the requirement to care?
Right now, I would say medicine is fighting very hard against that. And I think that's really good. I'm afraid that laws like this actually do push us in that direction. And that's one of the reasons I am worried about these laws. I think they're problematic, and they changed the nature of medicine. I'm sorry, so I was just asked, and I forgot already. Yeah, so the question actually was, do we foresee a change in how we go forward in medicine, where medicine does start taking on political, natures, and you have to go to a caregiver who holds your political views in order to get care, those sorts of things. I think that would be a disaster. I'll just say. And it's a disaster on about 4 different levels. I won't give you all the levels, but one of them, first of all, is, if I need care pretty quickly, I should be able to trust that whoever I go to is going to have my best interests in mind, and I can go to them and get care. I should just, that really is how medicine should function. And traditionally, this goes back centuries, that is how medicine should function. So we shouldn't have to worry about it there. But the other thing is that it's one thing if you belong to a really large political group. But what if you belong to a really weird, tiny little political group that nobody else really holds the views? Can you not get medical care anymore then? And on top of that, because most of us have our insurance deciding which caregivers we can go to anyways, you can see how complicated that's going to get very, very quickly because, yeah. And I hope not. Medicine has, as I said, centuries of pushing in the other direction. And so many of the caregivers I know think that's really important. That really matters. But we have to keep saying it matters. You can't just assume that it'll automatically stay. Yeah, excellent question. Yeah.
I have a mic. There we go. That's a mic that works.
Okay, so I feel like a lot of the talk spoke on issues of not refusing care to people based on their, the group they identify with, and rather conscious objection refers to actions taken. But what happens when the actions that doctors are asked to take align with the group that someone might identify with, such as a gender confirmation surgery? Because that is an action, but it's also an action that's not a life or death issue like many other that we've seen.
Yeah, and again, that's a great question, because as a matter of fact, one of the worries, and I think one of the worries that actually started this policy was specifically that medical professionals would be asked to perform, say, gender transformation surgery of some kind, and that would be really problematic. One of the reasons that is kind of I would almost say a red herring, is that to be a qualified medical professional, you have to get trained in the particular thing that you're going to get into. Now, if you don't want to do gender change surgery, you won't be trained in the same way that, for example, if you want to be an OBGYN and you don't want to perform abortions, there are plenty of places where you can go and get trained and you will never have to perform an abortion. But in a sense, the patient then, they can ask you, well, why won't you give me an abortion? And one of the things you can actually say is that is actually not something I'm trained in because I do think it's wrong. Does that make sense? Excuse me? Does that okay, so the question is, does that apply to hormone replacement therapy? Generally speaking, that's a very difficult one to even figure out where it should go, I'll just say. Because if you don't think that hormone replacement therapy is wrong for some people, but it is wrong for others, and again, that's the only way you're going to get the practice and get the training, you're going to have to come up with some reasons where it's acceptable, where it's not acceptable, and figure those sorts of things out. That gets, I'll just say, without going off too much in the weeds, that gets very complicated very, very quickly. If you want to get trained in exactly the sorts of things that might lead to, say, gender change type surgery, you're probably going into it because you think it's okay in the first place. Yeah.
So it seems that HB 1523 is designed to protect the caregiver. Mm-hmm. Would you amend it to equally protect the caregiver and the patient, or would you just say it's not worth saving, we need a new policy altogether, or how would you work with the existing legislation to equally promote the protection of both?
I'm going to give you a quick answer. I would say we should get rid of it. And there actually is a very good chance the Supreme Court may, if it does actually get brought before them, and I will tell you why. Because as a matter of fact, there has been a history in the US of some businesses and some caregivers choosing groups of people that they don't want to treat, and we know that because it happened during segregation and the pre-civil rights era. And the Supreme Court at that time, in probably one of the silliest names of any case that ever came before the Supreme Court, the Piggly Wiggly case, decided that even businesses, not just caregivers, but even businesses are not allowed to say, this Piggly Wiggly was actually a barbecue joint down in the South, and the owner of Piggly Wiggly claimed that his religious views said that he could not serve food to black people. That was very specifically what was set up, and the Supreme Court said, no, I'm sorry, but as a matter of fact, if you're selling a product, you have to be willing to sell it to, regardless of skin color and some of those things. Now, this is a slight change because this is moral views rather than, your skin color is not a moral, well, it is involved in moral rules, but yeah. But as a matter of fact, it identifies nonetheless that groups of people notion, and the Supreme Court in the past has held that this is unacceptable, and I don't know. I don't know where this is going to go legally, but I do think that that is where things should go.
Do you know why there's an exemption for emergency medical care? It seems odd. Like, why is this not a rule that applies across the board evenly?
Right. Actually, it's a fairly quick answer. It's a great question, but it's a fairly quick one. Emergency care that's necessary to sustain life can't be refused to anyone, just period, right off the bat. So if they'd put that in there, it would have been clearly unacceptable policy. They had to have the emergency exemption to do that. But there's also a very practical reason, which is if you're working in the emergency room, and I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked in emergency rooms, when somebody's coming in and they're unconscious, how on earth would you ever know what their views are on any of these sorts of things? That's not something you can actually sort of start. I guess you could look at tattoos maybe, but you can see how difficult it would be to even begin to think about how you might set that up in the kind of really rapid response you need in an emergency room. Yeah, and that doesn't just cover folks with whom the caregiver might disagree. That covers folks who are not legal immigrants. That covers, when somebody comes into an emergency room in need of life-saving treatment, they get it, period, end of story. That is required by law. Yeah, so.
You mentioned that the idea of being created in the image of God and being deserving of human dignity and respect is a core tenet of Reformed theology, which is clearly the case, but then why aren't more people talking about it in the Reformed Church?
I don't have any idea. I would say sometimes phrases go in and out of sort of style just a little bit. This was one, by the way, that I really did grow up with in many ways, was this notion that, as a matter of fact, sort of everyone you met. It was one of the interesting things for me because I did my graduate work at the University of Notre Dame, so I also hung out a whole bunch with a bunch of Catholics, and very serious. I worked in a lot of Catholic medical health systems with ethics things. And that image of God language shows up in a lot of the Catholic health system in terms of exactly how they set up their mission as a hospital, is that we want to treat every patient as if as if we see the image of God in them. And so it just felt so natural to talk about that. It came from my own tradition, it came from the Catholic tradition. It may just be that people are moving in a slightly different direction these days in terms of, sermons and what scriptures they like to bring up. I have no better answer, and I apologize for that.
I read rumors to the effect that some doctors refuse to treat obese patients. I have no idea whether those rumors are true, but if so, how does that fit in?
There have been issues with obesity. Generally speaking, it's not so much that physicians refuse to treat. It's that when patients who have severe obesity go to doctors, the doctors can't see any health issues other than the obesity. So people will come in with other health conditions, and they'll be told by their doctor, you have to lose weight. It's like, well, but I have knee problems. I actually need knee surgery. No, you have to lose weight. And it's almost as if, here's where bias comes in, right? I mean, this is one of those cases where sometimes you get something so focused on that you just can't see other things. And so obesity is seen as such a negative that, as a matter of fact, other things disappear. There's actually some very good statistical, sort of evidence that this is sort of how quite a few obese people, they're almost scared to go into doctors because they know they're going to get yelled at for being obese, and they're not going to get treated for the things that they actually need care for. I do not know of any caregivers, and I will just say this right off the bat, who refuse to care for obese patients altogether. I've not heard that. The world being what it is, and there being as many people as there are, who knows what has happened out there, but this is not a widespread practice in medicine.
You mentioned during the lecture about an LGBT group bringing forward either a lawsuit or a complaint against the law to the Supreme Court, but not having been brought in to the court itself. Has there been any sort of lawsuits within state Supreme Courts at all at this point?
There don't seem to have been many, and I'll tell you, it's very, very complicated. And you can imagine, sorry, this is going to get long, so hang on to your chair. It's really a complicated issue. The Supreme Court has already said that just because you are gay or lesbian or whatever, or hold the wrong views even, it's not just being gay or lesbian, but it's holding the wrong views. Just because you have that, you're not necessarily harmed by this, because you have to prove that you have standing, that you actually have been harmed. Now, if you think about it, if you're a lesbian couple looking for a pediatrician and you get the letter from the pediatrician that says, no, I'm not going to take your child because, as a matter of fact, you're a lesbian couple, do you want that pediatrician? I'm guessing you don't. I'm guessing you would look for a different, I'll just say, it seems to me pretty practical that you would just look for another one. But now to bring a law case, you have to say, I need this pediatrician, I'm being harmed by not getting them, I have to be able to. But if you've already found a new pediatrician, you weren't harmed. And so it becomes very, very difficult to actually, and most people, when they need medical care, need it right away. They're not gonna go off and do a lawsuit and wait and see what kind of, if that makes any sense. It's gonna take a very, very specific case. And most people don't wanna fight these things. I mean, it really is gonna take, because it has to be somebody who's actually harmed by this who can bring cases against it. It's gonna be difficult.
So, as someone who works in healthcare, I'm really curious as to if we find a causal link or more correlation between our current healthcare model as a pay-for-care system and these resulting legislation. Is this a result of physicians trying to gain control in a system where patients are expecting to pay for care that, the physician is then supposed to require to provide, whether it's, medically or necessary or appropriate or not? So I'm just curious of that, especially with our model that, we choose who our providers are, which is different than in other countries. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are regarding that.
Again, I do not have an easy answer. I'll just say, American healthcare is enormously complex, right? It's first of all, most patients don't get to choose sort of who all their care providers would be. Your insurance company decides. Do you get to choose who your insurance company is? No, your employer decides that for you, right? I mean, you can see the levels of complexity. I don't know how that has affected this particular issue. I will say it's actually pretty rare for patients to believe that as long as you have the money, you should be able to get anything you want. I mean, you do hit some people that do see it sort of that way, but the idea that it really is something that, sort of just an object that you can buy, I think to a large extent, people actually are so grateful when they can get medical care and when their insurance provider decides they'll actually pay for it, that's not one of the central sort of issues that's going on in this particular case. It could be one that's contributing to it. That I can't say one way or another. Yeah.
Thanks for this wonderful talk. It's so thought-provoking. So I'm wondering if, for example, just to play sort of devil's advocate, to think through, what if the argument weren't from the angle of individual purity? What if it were from the angle of complicity? Mm-hmm. And therefore it would be complicity in social harms, social structures that cause harm to the common good. You know, I've heard Roman Catholic arguments to that effect with contraception too. And I'm just wondering, I know the bar for complicity is going to have to be a lot higher. Do you know of any medical cases that have used complicity to play a role in conscientious objection, or would that be another sort of novel move here? And I don't think perhaps a very plausible one, but nonetheless, just wondering if you know the cases on this.
On this particular issue, I don't know of any cases. There have been some cases, I believe it was in a hospital in Massachusetts, where quite a number of the nursing staff said that they did not want to provide aftercare for patients who had had abortions because of complicity. And that was very specific, because they were not involved in the abortion, they did not contribute to it, but they didn't want to provide any care afterwards. They did actually pass that as an acceptable policy, and that the hospital does allow them to opt out of that kind of care. So that would be, in a sense, that one would be a case where the issue of complicity, I think, is coming up as much as can be identified.
Very specific action again, not complicity in some general social policy or structure.
I think that's exactly right. And it would get, I think, and again, I do think it gets dangerous if you start saying it's complicity in a widespread social practice, just because who's actually involved in that practice, who's not, who gets to define it, how it's set up, gets so complex so quickly. And I do think it's important. I mean, as I did start off with trust for a reason. I do think it's really important that caregivers and the patients that go to them need to be able to have a relationship of trust. And I think that becomes very problematic when we start choosing who gets care and who doesn't. Yeah.
If a physician who sees the view that marriage is between only man and woman as itself immoral, could they refuse care for someone who holds that view?
As the law is written, no. Yep. The law is very specific that you have to hold, that anyone who disagrees with these views can be refused, but it does not actually protect people who want to say, but if you hold the opposite views, then I get to refuse you. No, it's not an equal access in that way. Yeah.
So, say it works the other way, and if there's a patient who refuses care from a physician because they disagree with something about them. I've seen stories about patients not wanting care from a physician because of the color of their skin. And if there's another physician available to treat that patient, is there anything in place to protect the physicians? Say there are two providers, and the first provider the patient doesn't want. Does the hospital have to provide a second caregiver?
There's levels to your question, so it's a great question, and it actually kind of varies. One of the things is that medicine is a practice and it needs to keep moving. And so for an awful lot of social practices, if a patient comes in and says, I don't want to deal with that doctor, I only want a doctor that thinks this way or looks this way, it's just easier to shrug and go, fine, whatever. And most of the doctors are overworked and really, really busy, so it's kind of like, oh, good, I don't have to take care of that one. So you get a sort of situation like that. Now, when they start demanding that the only care they will accept, and this actually comes up almost more in nursing, interestingly enough, than with doctors, because if somebody is getting in-hospital care, right there, the nurses are coming through on a regular basis, and occasionally patients will say, yeah, I don't want this particular ethnic group, or I don't want this particular religious group to care for me. Generally speaking, patients do not have the right to do it. Hospitals will sometimes, again, just figure it's easier to just switch rooms and let one nurse go to the other room, because that way the patient still does get care. And that is one of the things about the patient's best interest being one of the things that's worried about is they really do need the care, right? Somebody's got to go in there and actually put their IV in. And if they're going to be screaming and thrashing around, yeah, what they're doing might be wrong. It still might be easier to do it that way. Does that make sense? I mean, so it's more a pragmatic question. Legally, I will just say patients do not have the right to say, no, I won't accept care from this kind of a thing. But practically, it happens sometimes.
So it seems to me like the way that the law has been implemented and the way that the law is written are like slightly different, because the law says that patients can refuse care to anyone who holds this position to be true. And also one of the positions that it holds to be true is like marriage or sex is reserved for marriage. Have we seen any instances where a caregiver has refused to provide for someone who, say, like is straight but promotes marriage equality, or is straight but is like living with their fiance and they aren't married yet, or something like that?
There haven't been a lot of reports on the cases about how these, sort of how cases like this kind of play out, in part because patients' information is confidential, right? And so unless the hospital goes out and advertises it, we're not going to find a lot of those sorts of things. The pediatrician case is pretty close to that sort of a case, because I'll just say, a newborn infant is not going to actually have a lot of views about sexuality at all. But the fact that their parents hold the wrong views, has gotten them out of that pediatrician's care. Other than that, it's really hard to know how this would play out. I'll also say one of the ironies of all of this, of course, is that we live in a world in which marriage is not between one man and one woman. People get divorced all the time, and they have lots and lots of spouses, and that's very normal. And as far as anyone can tell, no one is saying that because someone's divorced, they shouldn't get care, right? I mean, that's just not even in there. And yet, that actually would put them in violation of the moral principles that are being held up here.
Thank you very much for a stimulating evening of thoughtful reflection on these issues, and it's about time we gave you a break and headed downstairs to celebrate with a dessert reception. Will you join me in thanking Dr. Grunheld?